Before the clock, five stars who defined the NBA's forgotten era. Professional basketball's first 8 years were rawer, slower, and stranger than the game played today, and the men who thrived in them deserve to be remembered. It was a league born in hockey rinks. On June 6, 1946, a group of arena owners met in New York and did something that had nothing to do with basketball. They were trying to fill seats. Their buildings, Madison Square Garden, Boston Garden, the Philadelphia Arena, had been built for hockey. On the nights when the NHL tenants were on the road, the arenas sat empty and the lights stayed off. Basketball, they reasoned, could change that. So they formed the Basketball Association of America, hired some coaches, signed some players, and opened for business on November 1st, 1946, when the New York Knickerbockers visited the Toronto Huskies at Maple Leaf Gardens. The result was a low-scoring, physically rough game played before sparse crowds in arenas designed for different sport. The BAA was not exactly the league its founders had envisioned. Several franchises folded within 2 seasons. The game averaged just 67.8 points per team in year one. There was no shot clock, no three-point line, a free throw lane only 6 feet wide, and the rosters of players earning $5,000 to $6,000 a year. A living wage, but hardly the makings of a professional sports empire. The rival National Basketball League had operated since 1937, rooted in Midwestern industrial towns, Fort Wayne, Anderson, Sheboygan, backed by factory owners who sponsored teams as a form of community goodwill. Its players were tougher and more experienced, and two of its brightest stars, Bob Davies and the giant George Mikan, leveraged the competition between the leagues to secure contracts worth as much as $12,000 a year, considered outrageous at the time. On August 3rd, 1949, the BAA absorbed the NBL and renamed itself the National Basketball Association. 17 teams entered that first combined season. The game had a unified home for the first time. What it didn't have yet was an identity or a clock. So what did basketball look like without one? Imagine a game where the team in the league can simply hold the ball indefinitely. No timer, no pressure to shoot, no mechanism to force action. If your opponent had a weapon you couldn't neutralize, you could just stop engaging with them. You could make the game disappear. This is what pre-shot clock NBA basketball looked like in its worst moments. Teams protecting a lead would pass laterally and backward, cycling the ball around the perimeter while the crowd groaned and the clock wound down. Without a mandate to attempt a field goal, the offensive team held all the power, and savvy coaches used it ruthlessly. It reached its logical, absurd conclusion on November 22nd, 1950. The Fort Wayne Pistons, facing the Minneapolis Lakers in their unstoppable center, George Mikan, decided the only way to win was not to let Mikan touch the ball. They slowed the game to a crawl, passing without shooting, fouling strategically when possession changed hands. The final score is 19-18 Fort Wayne. It remains the lowest scoring game in NBA history. Fans who paid to watch that game left furious. The league's credibility took a serious blow. By 1954, the NBA had contracted to just 8 teams, hemorrhaging franchises and fan interest simultaneously. The man who rescued it was Danny Biasoni, owner of the Syracuse Nationals, who jotted a calculation on what has been called a napkin. He noticed that his favorite games featured roughly 120 total shot attempts, 60 per team. He divided the 2,880 seconds in a 48-minute game by 120 and got 24. His general manager, Leo Ferris, helped him refine the idea, and the NBA adopted the 24-second shot clock for the 1954-55 season. Scoring leapt immediately. The plodding, foul play games gave way to something faster and more urgent. The league that had nearly vanished was suddenly worth watching. But before that moment, 8 years of extraordinary basketball were played under conditions that would be unrecognizable today. These are 5 of the men who played it best. George Mikan. There's a story, spiritually true, that Madison Square Garden once put a sign outside its marquee that read, George Mikan versus the Knicks. Not the Lakers versus the Knicks, Mikan versus the Knicks. One man framed as the entire opposing attraction. It wasn't wrong. Mikan stood at 6'10" in an era when that height was essentially supernatural. He wore thick glasses and moved with an efficiency that opponents found maddening, not graceful, but precise and relentless, like a piece of machinery that knew exactly how much room it needed to operate. He had developed his inside game under Ray Meyer at DePaul, where he famously drilled himself by alternately shooting left-handed and right-handed hooks until both felt natural. The drill he perfected, a rhythmic series of close-range layups, alternating sides, that still bears his name today. In the 6-foot lane of early professional basketball, Mikan was impossible. He could plant himself, catch the ball, and score. He led the BAA and then the NBA in scoring for 3 consecutive seasons, beginning in 1948-49. He powered the Lakers to 5 championships in 6 years across 3 different leagues, the NBL title in 48, the BAA title in 49, and NBA championships in 50, 52, 53, and 54. He averaged 23.1 points and 13.4 rebounds per game for his career, numbers that were not just impressive but structurally dominant in a low-scoring era. Mikan was so dominant he prompted several significant rule changes in the NBA, including the introduction of the goaltending rule, the widening of the foul lane, known as the Mikan rule, and the creation of the shot clock. The goaltending rule came first. Early in Mikan's career, it was legal to swat shots off the backboard or even out of the air on the downward arc, so Mikan positioned himself to do exactly that, erasing opponents' attempts with his long arms. The league banned the practice specifically because of him. The lane widening came next. The Mikan rule refers to a change by the NBA in the 51-52 season that widened the foul lane from 6 feet to 12 feet. The paint's 16 feet today. Before, Mikan was barely wider than a doorway, and he camped in it like a man who owned the property. And then there was the 19-18 game. The Pistons held on to the ball for a vast majority of the match in order to not allow Mikan to dominate them in the paint, which worked so well to the point where it resulted in the lowest scoring match in NBA history and subsequently led to the creation of the shot clock a few seasons later. Mikan retired before the shot clock era began, having spent his whole career navigating a game that kept rewriting its own rules to slow him down. None of it worked. He was voted the greatest player of the first half of the 20th century in a 1950 Associated Press poll, a distinction awarded while he was still actively playing and still changing the sport. Bob Cousy arrived in the NBA in 1950 looking by his own admission like he didn't belong. He was slight, his shooting stroke was unorthodox, and the ball-handling tricks he'd developed on playgrounds of Queens, behind-the-back dribbles, no-look passes, switches of the hand, mid-drive were considered showboating rather than basketball. His first coach at Holy Cross literally benched him for being too fancy. Known as the Houdini of the hardwood, he dazzled fans with his dribbling skill and behind-the-back passes. Cousy led the NBA in assists from 53 to 60, his one-game record of 28 still standing until 1978. What made Cousy remarkable in the pre-shot clock era specifically was that he was playing a different game than everybody else, a faster, more improvisational game years before the rules caught up to what he was doing. In a league still dominated by plotting, set plays, and deliberate half-court offense, Cousy was already running and creating. He saw past other players didn't know were available. He made decisions at a speed the game hadn't formalized yet. He joined the Celtics not through the draft, but through a dispersal lottery after the Chicago Stags folded. Boston coach Red Auerbach initially didn't want him, preferring a more conventional player. The crowd at the press conference chanted his name until ownership relented. Auerbach, to his credit, recognized what he had and built around it. The behind-the-back dribble that Cousy helped popularize wasn't his invention. Seton Hall's Bob Davies had used the move in 1941, but Cousy refined it into a functional weapon rather than a theatrical gesture. In a slow game, he was the fast version of the future. The shot clock, when it came, essentially validated everything he had been doing instinctively for 4 years. He played his pre-clock seasons without the structure that would have suited him most. His assist numbers were remarkable anyway. Bob Davies spent his entire professional career in Rochester, New York, first in the NBL and then in the NBA with the Royals. And he did so at a moment when professional basketball was figuring out what it wanted to be. Davies was one of the most creative ball handlers of his generation. He had used the behind-the-back mentioned earlier in 1941, a move so far ahead of its time that it took a decade, and Cousy's emergence to become accepted as legitimate basketball. Davies was a guard in the true modern sense, a distributor who could score, a playmaker who elevated teammates, a player whose game was built on deception and quickness rather than size. He led the league in assists in 1948, 49 season and made 4 consecutive All-BAA, All-NBA first teams from 49 to 52. He won an NBA championship with the Royals in 51. His star was bright enough during the BAA-NBL rivalry that star players such as Bob Davies and the Giant center George Mikan had benefited from the rivalry between the leagues to secure generous contracts. Davies operated in an era when the guard position was still being defined, when the concept of a primary ball handler and decision maker hadn't fully yet crystallized. He and Kuzi, overlapping in time, similar in instinct, were essentially inventing the position as they played it. Without the shot clock's mandate for pace, they would eventually make their style of play the only viable one. Dolph Schayes of the Syracuse Nationals was in many ways the complete opposite of the glamour players of his era. He wasn't a showman. He wasn't rewriting the rule book by his presence alone. He was simply one of the best scorers in the league for a sustained, improbable stretch of time. A power forward before the position had a name, a rebounder, a free throw artist, a player who appeared in the All Star game every year from 51 through 61. Shays played for the Nationals, the same team owned by Danny Biasoni, the man who invented the shot clock. He was the franchise's engine through the lean years of early NBA basketball, putting up points and rebounds in a league that was still deciding whether it would survive. When the Nationals beat the Fort Wayne Pistons in Game 7 of the 55 NBA Finals, the first finals played under the shot clock rules, Shays was one of the players who made it happen. In the pre-clock era, or seasons, Shays had already established himself as a force. He finished in the top 5 in scoring most seasons, averaged double figures in rebounds before rebounds were even officially tracked for individual players, and did it all while playing through a broken wrist for much of one season, wearing a cast and still logging significant minutes because the rosters were thin and the schedules were relentless. His scoring came from everywhere: mid-range jumpers, drives to the basket, and an exceptional free throw line where he converted at rates that would be excellent in any era. In a game where deliberate offense was the norm, Shays could score in the half court or in transition, and opponents had no single way to stop him. Bob Ferrick's perhaps the least remembered name among the great players in professional basketball's founding era, and that's mostly a product of timing. He played in the very first BAA season of 46-47 and was the league's leader in win shares, the statistical embodiment of how much winning he contributed to the Washington Capitals. Ferrick was a guard whose game centered on efficiency. In a low-scoring league where each possession carried enormous weight, he made the right play more consistently than almost anyone. He shot accurately at a time when the field goal percentage was well below 30% across the league and led the Capitals to the best record in the BAA in the 46-47 season. He retired in 1950 before the NBL mergers had fully settled into the combined league, before Mikan's full dominance had reshaped the game, before the shot clock made his careful, deliberate style either obsolete or vindicated. He went on to coach at Santa Clara for years, developing players who would eventually populate the league he helped found. Ferrick was a man of the opening chapter, someone whose career was entirely contained within the BAA's founding moment. He never had the shot clock, never had the expanded rosters, never had the television contracts that would eventually make basketball stars into household names. He just played as well as anyone in the first few years of the professional game. To watch a pre-shot clock NBA basketball through modern lenses, to see a sport that resembles today's game structurally but operates on an entirely different principle. The court's the same, the basket's the same height. 10 men played at a time, but the pace, the strategy, and the leverage between offense and defense are fundamentally different. The product was rough, low-scoring affairs played before sparse crowds and cavernous hockey rinks, and several franchises folding in the first 2 seasons. Players traveled by bus and train between games in cities that barely knew the sport existed. Salaries were modest, rosters were small. If you got hurt, you often played through it because there wasn't always a replacement and the schedule didn't pause. The game was physical in a way the modern rulebook prohibits. Hand-checking hard fouls and contact under the basket were simply accepted. Officiating was inconsistent between arenas, and the home court advantage was partly because the home team knew which floorboard squeaked. What the players in this era had, and what the history books sometimes fail to credit, was the full expression of basketball as a contest of will rather than pace. Without a clock forcing action, every possession was a negotiation. Every defensive stop was a genuine crisis off for the offense. Every point was earned within the structure where time could be weaponized. The men who thrived under those conditions, Mikan by force of physical dominance, Kuzi and Davies by creativity and speed, Shays by relentless completeness, Ferrick by efficiency and intelligence, were not playing a lesser game. They were playing a different one. When Danny Biasoni divided 2880 by 120, got 24, he didn't make basketball better so much as he made it different. The players of the pre-shot clock era were the last generation who had to be good enough to win without the clock's guarantee of action. Most of them adapted. Mikan retired. Kuzi thrived. The 1918 game that started it all happened on a November night in 1950. The final score looked like a misprint. It wasn't. It was the sport reaching its breaking point. It and the men on the floor that night on both sides were playing the game as it existed, with all its flaws and the strange, deliberate beauty. The clock came 4 years later. Professional basketball was never quite the same. The net wins formula and all written content are original works, all rights reserved. You can access the database at willf123.github.io/NBA-net-wins. Thank you.